Thank you very much. So I'm the only obstacle between you and dinner. That's not a nice place to be. But thank you very much to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Gain for inviting me. This is a very important meeting and very interesting. And I'm going to talk about the experiences that we have had in Mexico on the fight against the double burden of malnutrition. And Mexico is a country that has been facing the double burden of malnutrition, both undernutrition and obesity, for almost 30 years. And we have evolved, so now we have less undernutrition and more obesity. And we at first started fighting against undernutrition, and now we are really very much fighting obesity. So these are some data from Mexico, and you can see that stunting has been down from about almost 27%, this was almost 30 years ago, to 10% today. Anemia in children also has decreased, although not as much, and also anemia in women. But overweight and obesity, you can look at the huge increase. For example, if you go to adolescent girls from 11 to 38%, that's really amazing in only 30 years. And in women, 20 to 49 years from, well, this from 61 was only about 10 years ago. It was really from 35 to 72%. So it's really a very, very large increase. And of course, part of the reduction of undernutrition was the result of some of the programs and policies that Mexico has been implementing. All these measurements in terms of monitoring trends in Mexico have been conducted by the National Institute of Public Health. I am the general director, and we have been following these trends for 30 years, not only the trends of the nutrition conditions, but also the risk factors. And those have been very much used for planning interventions. So the first example I'm going to give you is the fight against undernutrition, stunting, and micronutrient deficiencies. So it was really before 1988, we started looking at the situation of undernutrition in Mexico. We were spending a lot of money, about $2 million per day in food aid, and the undernutrition was really increasing. So we looked in 1990, we analyzed the problem and looked at, we had high prevalences of stunting and anemia. We also had nutrition inequities between regions in Mexico, and we really needed to target the interventions to low-income and indigenous populations. We had evidence that we needed to target the interventions in the first 1,000 days of life and needed to improve micronutrient and not only energy and protein intakes. The programs at that time were spending a lot of money and the results were very disappointing despite these high expenditures. And the reasons were inadequate targeting, inappropriate interventions that were not evidence-based, including, for example, inadequate foods distributed and sometimes distributed to the wrong population, and then lack of monitoring and evaluation. It was amazing that we had been distributing foods for over 40 years without any monitoring and evaluation. In 1997, a new program was created in Mexico. It was called PROGRESA, and it included a nutrition component. This is a program that's still going on. It's a conditional cash transfer that is used as incentive for investments in nutrition, health, and education. Women receive the cash transfers as long as they comply with the demand for health, education, and nutrition services. And we provided also fortified food supplements that were specific for children of that age. We included also nutrition education, and we targeted to low-income households in rural areas and to children under 2 years of age and pregnant and lactating women. And we included since the beginning an evaluation component. We were able to show, and Lynette Neufeld was also in Mexico at that time, luckily, and we worked together and were able to show that through very, very good evaluation projects, that this program had an impact on the reduction of stunting in Mexico. Now, moving to the obesity, overweight, and obesity. So, just to remind you, 1/3 of every school children, 40% of all adolescents, and 70% of adults in Mexico are either overweight or obese. It's a huge, huge problem. And one of the problems is the food intake. On the left side, if you look at that, the left side of the screen, you are going to see the basic foods. So that is grains, legumes, milk and dairy, meat, fruits and vegetables, and fats. And that's the basic consumption, and that accounts for 75% of all energy consumed. The other 25% of energy comes from what we call discretionary foods. So this is really sugar-sweetened beverages and what people call junk food. This is just sugar, fat, and a very highly processed food. We consume in Mexico 12.5% of all our energy from sugar, and of that, 70% comes from sugary sweetened beverages. We consume 170 liters per capita per year of sugar sweetened beverages in Mexico. So it was very easy to decide, to point to the sugar sweetened beverages as one of the foods that should be limited in their intake. So we conducted some additional research looking, for example, at the price elasticity of demand for sugar-sweetened beverages, cross-price elasticities between sugar-sweetened beverages and water. And we came up with the design of a tax that we share with the government and with non-governmental organizations. And the tax passed. This was almost 5 years ago, and we have evaluated the tax, and it turns out that the tax of the sugar sweetened beverages, that is about 10% tax, so the increase in price is about 10% tax, and the reduction in intake or purchases is about 8%, and it has persisted over 2 years now. We also had a tax on junk food, and that tax is about, I'm sorry, that's wrong. It's about, it's 8%, that's right, but the reduction is about 6% in purchases. So in addition to the taxes, we think that there is not a magic bullet, as was mentioned this morning. You really need a comprehensive strategy that is multi-sectorial. And we advise the government to have this multi-sectoral intervention. And the government took some of our advice, not all of them, but many of the elements that we recommended. So we have a front-of-pack labeling in Mexico. We have a food and beverage regulations in schools. For example, sugar-sweetened beverages are not allowed in schools. The taxes, the regulation of marketing to children in TV and movie theaters during selected schedules and programs. We have a massive campaign promoting general behaviors like eating less, moving, and attending primary health clinics to measure weight. And then dietary guidelines and primary health care and counseling on breastfeeding and complementary feeding in young children. So we have been evaluating some of the interventions, unfortunately not all of them. For example, the front-of-pack labeling, we conducted just a design evaluation, and it was very easy to find that it is unlikely to have an effect on decisions at the point of formulation, at the point of purchase, because the problem is that it is not very easy for the people to notice if they should purchase or not. There is a new system that has been now applied in Chile, the warning system in Chile, that seems to be much better in terms of identifying which of the products are high in sugar, in calories, in sodium. We also, the food and beverage regulations in schools, unfortunately, we found that they had a lot of implementation problems. For example, teachers have not been trained, principals and parents have not been trained either, and there is a lack of accountability mechanisms. The taxes are the ones that have been successful. Then the marketing to children has been fine, except that the time during the day that this is applied is not perfect. For example, from 7 to 10 p.m. there is a lot of children audience, and the regulations do not apply. And then some of the other components have not been applied. So now we have a great opportunity because Mexico is having a new government that starts in the 1st of December. We are publishing a new book that will take the recommendations made to the government 6 years ago. We are updating them, and we are, for example, suggesting to switch to a warning system labeling to improve the implementation of the programs in schools, to increase the taxes to 20%, and also to regulate marketing to children during a more comprehensive time period. And of course, we have to evaluate the other components before making any other recommendation. So in conclusion, Mexico still suffers a double burden of malnutrition, but the prevalence of undernutrition has decreased over the last decades, while the prevalence of overweight and obesity has increased. We have had effective interventions to reduce the prevalence of undernutrition, and the main risks for obesity are unhealthy diets. And of course, I gave the example of sugar-sweetened beverages and junk food, but of course there is also lack of fruit, vegetable intake, very low intakes of legumes and so on. Interventions for the prevention of obesity have been successful for the tax of sugar-sweet beverages and junk food, but other interventions have implementation problems or lack of evaluation. And at the end, my last conclusion is that the double burden of malnutrition can be prevented, but policies require rigorous evaluation before we can recommend other policies or the improvement of these policies. Thank you very much.